You are listening to Bedtime Dreamy Tales. Share and subscribe our channel. Story title: The Golden Key, Part 4. Why should I leave you? I don't know the young man, she said to the lady. I am never allowed to keep my children long. You need not go with him except you please, but you must go someday. And I should like you to go with him, for he has the golden key. No girl need be afraid to go with a youth that has the golden key. You will take care of her, Mossy, will you not? That I will, said Mossy. And Tangle cast a glance at him and thought she should like to go with him. And, said the lady, if you should lose each other as you go through I never can remember the name of that country. Do not be afraid, but go on and on. She kissed Tangle on the mouth and Mossy on the forehead, led them to the door and waved her hand eastward. Mossy and Tangle took each other's hand and walked away into the depth of the forest. In his right hand, Mossy held the golden key. They wandered thus a long way, with endless amusement from the talk of the animals. They soon learned enough of their language to ask them necessary questions. The squirrels were always friendly and gave them nuts out of their own hoards, but the bees were selfish and rude, justifying themselves on the ground that Tangle and Mossy were not subjects of their queen, and charity must begin at home, though indeed they had not one drone in their poorhouse at the time. Even the blinking moles would fetch them an earth nut or a truffle now and then, talking as if their mouths, as well as their eyes and ears, were full of cotton wool or their own velvety fur. By the time they got out of the forest, they were very fond of each other, and Tangle was not in the least sorry that her grandmother had sent her away with Mossy. At length, the trees grew smaller and stood farther apart, and the ground began to rise, and it got more and more steep, till the trees were all left behind, and the two were climbing a narrow path with rocks on each side. Suddenly, they came upon a rude doorway, by which they entered a narrow gallery cut in the rock. It grew darker and darker, till it was pitch dark, and they had to feel their way. At length, the light began to return, and at last they came out upon a narrow path on the face of a lofty precipice. This path went winding down the rock to a wide plain, circular in shape, and surrounded on all sides by mountains. Those opposite to them were a great way off, and towered to an awful height, shooting up sharp, blue, ice-enameled pinnacles. An utter silence reigned where they stood. Not even the sound of water reached them. Looking down, they could not tell whether the valley below was a grassy plain or a great still lake. They had never seen any place look like it. The way to it was difficult and dangerous, but down the narrow path they went and reached the bottom in safety. They found it composed of smooth, light-colored sandstone, undulating in parts, but mostly level. It was no wonder to them now that they had not been able to tell what it was, for this surface was everywhere crowded with shadows. It was a sea of shadows. The mass was chiefly made up of the shadows of leaves, innumerable, of all lovely and imaginative forms, waving to and fro, floating and quivering in the breath of a breeze whose motion was unfelt, whose sound was unheard. No forests clothed the mountainsides, no trees were anywhere to be seen. And yet the shadows of the leaves, branches and stems of all various trees covered the valley as far as their eyes could reach. They soon spied the shadows of flowers mingled with those of the leaves, and now and then the shadow of a bird with open beak and throat distended with song. At times would appear the forms of strange, graceful creatures running up and down the shadow boles and along the branches to disappear in the wind-tossed foliage. As they walked, they waded knee-deep in the lovely lake, for the shadows were not merely lying on the surface of the ground, but heaped up above it like substantial forms of darkness, as if they had been cast upon 1,000 different planes of the air. Tangle and Mossy often lifted their heads and gazed upwards to descry whence the shadows came, but they could see nothing more than a bright mist spread above them, higher than the tops of the mountains, which stood clear against it. No forests, no leaves, no birds were visible. After a while, they reached more open spaces where the shadows were thinner, and came even to portions over which shadows only flitted, leaving them clear for such as might follow. Now a wonderful form, half bird-like, half human, would float across on outspread sailing pinions. Anon, an exquisite shadow group of gambolling children would be followed by the loveliest female form, and that again by the grand stride of a titanic shape, each disappearing in the surrounding press of shadowy foliage. Sometimes a profile of unspeakable beauty or grandeur would appear for a moment and vanish. Sometimes they seemed lovers that passed linked arm in arm, sometimes father and son, sometimes brothers in loving contest, sometimes sisters entwined in gracefulest community of complex form. Sometimes wild horses would tear across, free or bestrode by noble shadows of ruling men. But some of the things which pleased them most, they never knew how to describe. About the middle of the plain, they sat down to rest in the heart of a heap of shadows. After sitting for a while, each, looking up, saw the other in tears. They were each longing after the country whence the shadows fell. "We must find the country from which the shadows come," said Mossy. "We must, dear Mossy," responded Tangle. "What if your golden key should be the key to it?" "Ah, that would be grand," returned Mossy. "But we must rest here for a little, and then we shall be able to cross the plain before night." So he lay down on the ground, and about him on every side and over his head was the constant play of the wonderful shadows. He could look through them and see the one behind the other till they mixed in a mass of darkness. Tangle too lay admiring and wondering and longing after the country whence the shadows came. When they were rested, they rose and pursued their journey. How long they were in crossing this plain I cannot tell, but before night Mossy's hair was streaked with grey, and Tangle had got wrinkles on her forehead. As evening drew on, the shadows fell deeper and rose higher. At length they reached a place where they rose above their heads and made all dark around them. Then they took hold of each other's hand and walked on in silence and in some dismay. They felt the gathering darkness and something strangely solemn besides, and the beauty of the shadows ceased to delight them. All at once, Tangle found that she had not a hold of Mossy's hand, though when she lost it, she couldn't tell. "Mossy, Mossy!" she cried aloud in terror. But no Mossy replied. A moment after, the shadows sank to her feet and down under her feet, and the mountains rose before her. She turned towards the gloomy region she had left and called once more upon Mossy. There, the gloom lay tossing and heaving, a dark, stormy, foamless sea of shadows, but no Mossy rose out of it or came climbing up the hill on which she stood. She threw herself down and wept in despair. Suddenly, she remembered that the beautiful lady had told them if they lost each other in a country of which she could not remember the name, they were not to be afraid, but to go straight on. "And besides," she said to herself, "Mossy has the golden key, and so no harm will come to him, I do believe." She rose from the ground and went on. Before long she arrived at a precipice, in the face of which a stair was cut. When she had ascended halfway, the stair ceased, and the path led straight into the mountain. She was afraid to enter, and turning again towards the stair, grew giddy at the sight of the depth beneath her, and was forced to throw herself down in the mouth of the cave. When she opened her eyes, she saw a beautiful little creature with wings standing beside her, waiting. "I know you," said Tangle. "You are my fish." "Yes, but I am a fish no longer. I am an aëranth now." "What is that?" asked Tangle. "What you see I am," answered the shape, "and I am come to lead you through the mountain." "Oh, thank you, dear fish. Aëranth, I mean," returned Tangle, rising. Thereupon the aëranth took to his wings and flew on through the long, narrow passage, reminding Tangle very much of the way he had swum on before her when he was a fish. And the moment his white wings moved, they began to throw off a continuous shower of sparks of all colours, which lighted up the passage before them. All at once he vanished, and Tangle heard a low, sweet sound, quite different from the rush and crackle of his wings. Before her was an open arch, and through it came light, mixed with the sound of sea waves. She hurried out and fell, tired and happy, upon the yellow sand of the shore. There she lay, half asleep with weariness and rest, listening to the low plash and retreat of the tiny waves, which seemed ever enticing the land to leave off being land and become sea. And as she lay, her eyes were fixed upon the foot of a great rainbow standing far away against the sky on the other side of the sea. At length, she fell fast asleep. When she awoke, she saw an old man with long white hair down to his shoulders, leaning upon a stick covered with green buds and so bending over her. If you like this story, please give this video a like. For more stories, go to bedtimedreamytales.com. See you in the next story.